morning, Algonquin. Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance and remain standing for a moment of silence. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Welcome to the 17th annual first virtual Richtall's Read All Day. We had a literacy teacher in 6th grade named Ms. Richtall, and she started Richtall's Read All Day 17 years ago to celebrate reading and literacy. In this photo, she's reading The Lightning Thief by Rick Riordan. We miss her smile and hearing her say, "Hello, my friend." So because today is the first virtual Richtall's Read All Day, that means take some time out of your day today, sit in your favorite spot, just read. Read to siblings, parents, or guardians, maybe meet up with a friend online and read to each other. Whatever it looks like, just read sometime today. We'd also love to see your photos. Take a photo of you reading in your favorite spot and send it to Mrs. Conti or me. Bonus, if you post it on social media with the hashtag AMSRRAD. Photos also may be shared on the AMS News and on social media, and one lucky winner will receive a special prize. So to celebrate today, the author of Posted, John David Anderson, is going to answer questions from students. I don't know how that, I think that's the wrong picture. Okay. Oh, here's the right picture. Sorry. Okay. So there's John David Anderson. And drum roll, he will answer questions from you. And after the video, I will be reading the first chapter of the Ichabod, J.K. Rowling's new manuscript. That will be a book in November. Have a great day, Algonquin.
Hey there, all you cool students of Algonquin Middle School. This is John David Anderson, the author of a lot of books for middle grade readers. I am here today to talk to you about Posted and answer some of your questions, which thank you very much for reading the book. Before we get started, I thought I'd tell you a little bit about myself. I have been writing since I was 17 years old. That's when I wrote my very first novel. It was called Low to Be One with the Universe, and it was terrible. I'm the only person who's ever read it. But at that moment, I knew that that's what I wanted to be for the rest of my life. And it only took then, 13 years, 2 college degrees, 5 jobs, 34 rejection letters, untold stress, pain, tears, blood, you name it, before I actually got my first book published. But since then, I've been able to publish, almost a book a year. I get to do this for a living. I think writing is the greatest job in the world. I get to go to work in my pajamas. Of course, now everybody gets to go to work in their pajamas. There's a lot of chocolate. Obviously, I get to live inside my head. I get to talk to the voices and the characters and create whole worlds and lie to kids for a living. So it's a lot of fun. And I think most importantly, I get to tell stories. And storytelling is one of the most powerful things that we can do. It's how we create traditions. It's how we bind as communities. It's how we hopefully keep from repeating history. Storytelling is what connects us to each other, right? And I think nowadays especially, it's important to flex your storytelling chops to find ways to connect with people out in the world. And find a way to tell the story of what's happening now so that, maybe we can do better next time. So, of course, I have a lot more I can tell you about writing and the publishing process and my books and all that stuff. But I thought maybe the best way to go about that would be just to answer some of your questions. For example, Kath G asks, how many books have I written? That is an excellent question. I have probably written about 25 books. Now, the better question is, how many books have I published? I've published 10 books, which either means that I'm a terrible writer or that getting published is a little difficult. I prefer to think it's the second one, but, I leave judgment up to you. I can actually show you some of the books. So we got some fantasy, some superheroes, some villains, back to fantasy. 3 boys break their teacher out of the hospital to give her the last day she deserves. Kid wakes up, finds his life has been turned into a video game. You guys know that one. Fairy tries to grant a wish, and the family tries to deal with their grandfather's death. And one of the coolest things about being an author, or any kind of creative profession, whether you're painting or drawing or dancing or engineering or whatever it is that you get to experiment, right? You get to try new things. And so over the course of the 10 novels that I've published, I've written fantasy, and I've written superheroes, and I've dealt with, realistic fiction and bullying and teachers with cancer and fairies and families and, all kinds of stuff. I mean, the really great thing about an imagination is it's kind of unbridled, right? It can take you anywhere you want it to take you. You just have to be willing to go on that trip. Michelle F. asks, what inspired you to start writing books? And I think that's a great question. And I imagine I started writing for the same reason that most people start writing. That is, I started writing for myself because I enjoyed it, because I had voices inside my head that I wanted to get out. And I started writing because I love to read. And I don't think you're ever going to find a writer anywhere that doesn't start out as an avid reader. I think we start for very personal reasons, and I think that's the best motive for starting to write a story, is because you want to tell it, right? The only reader that you should be worried about the first time you write a story is you, right? Tell a story that you're going to enjoy. Tell a story that takes you to a place that you want to go. Tell a story that speaks to the emotions that you've experienced in your own personal life. But now I think my motivation comes from you guys, from my young readers. Because if I can get you to go home and pick up a book instead of an Xbox controller or your iPad or whatever, and just read for like 15 minutes, just get lost in somebody else's universe for 15 minutes, maybe think about things or ask really cool questions, then that's really valuable to me, right? And that's one of the chief motivators now for why I do what I do. Eternity R also asks, what is your schedule like when you're writing books? I'm what's called a pantser, which means that I don't plan anything. I never have an outline. There's never like post-it notes or anything, scattered across my desk telling me where I should go next. I have no idea where I'm going to go next. Every novel that I write is a mystery novel in that I don't know what's going to happen. And so what I do then is I sit down and I just sort of type madly for like 6 hours straight. And I just go in all kinds of different directions. And I let the characters tell me what their issue is and how they hope to solve it. And if at any point I feel like my characters are doing too well, I just throw in a T-Rex, right? Or a giant rampaging robot, or a zit, or a cute boy or girl that they can pine over or something, because I don't want them to ever feel like life is easy, right? That's the great thing about being an author, is that you're basically God, and you can put your characters through as much personal torment as you want them to go through. Probably my most interesting writing quirk is the blah blah blah, and I know I'm not the only person who does this, but because I'm a pantser, because I don't plan out what I'm going to do or say next in a book, I have a tendency to get stuck, and when I get stuck, I just write blah blah blah. So sometimes blah 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 is just a word I can't think of, and sometimes blah 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 is a sentence that I can't think of, and sometimes it's a whole paragraph of description of a setting that I don't even know what it looks like, and sometimes it's an entire chapter in the middle of the novel, and I have no idea how I'm going to connect point B to point D. All I know is that I don't want to deal with it right then. And so I write blah, blah, blah. And then when I get to the end of the book, I go back and I find all the blah, blah, blahs, and I beat my head right against the wall, trying to figure out the best way to fill in those blanks. Meg S. has our first specific question regarding the book, which is what inspired me to write Posted. There are probably 50 or 60 sources of inspiration for every novel that I write, or that anybody writes. I don't think you can ever pin it down to just one thing. But there's usually a spark, there's usually a little moment that gets you kick-started. And for me, it was waking up one morning, 4 o'clock in the morning, and I had an image in my head of a Post-it note that just said, I'm sorry, right? 2 words. And so I did what all great writers do, is I asked questions. And the 4 questions I asked were, who wrote the note? Who'd they give it to? What did they do that they were sorry about? And why a Post-it note? And note, in answering those 4 questions, I had characters, and I had conflict, and I had a hook. Like, I had a lot of the pieces and parts that would go into making the novel just based on this one little image that I had in my head. And that's why it's really important, if you're an author, to be observant, right? To keep your eyes and ears open, to never assume that one minor detail that you see or hear about in your life is insignificant, because it's not. It could actually spur an entire universe, right? It can actually create whole plot lines just based on a little image that you get inside your head. So that was the first thing that I would say sparked the inspiration for the novel. But the ongoing inspiration came from what I saw going on in the world around me, right? Which is, the power of words. When I was revising the novel, for example, was during the presidential primaries for the latest race for president. And I noticed all these people in positions of authority, all these adults vying for the position of the greatest job in the land, basically bullying each other, calling each other names. And that hasn't changed much, Still people in authority bully each other and call each other names. But it kind of got to me that, we expect our kids to be kind to each other and to use their words carefully. And as adults, we can't manage to do the same. Addie H. asks, are the events in the book based on real circumstances? Addie H., none of the events in the book are specifically based on anything that happened to me in my own life. But all of the emotional experience that the characters went through is based on things that I went through when I was in middle school. So, for example, I was short, glasses, right, a bit of a nerd, didn't have a whole lot of friends, right, kind of a social outcast, as it were, and as a result of that, I was pretty easy to pick on. And the one place you did not want to go in my middle school, for sure, was the bathroom, because that's where all the mean kids hung out. So, it's just off limits. So for 3 years, from 6th grade to 8th grade, I didn't use the bathroom one single time. Go before I went to school, I'd wait till I got home. I held it the whole time in between because I was afraid. I was afraid to use the restroom. And the result of that is, I think now I have a bladder the size of Montana, but at the same time, right, I have emotional scarring that I've had to deal with by writing books. The apprehension that the characters feel, right? The sense that they might lose their friends, the sense that the tribe could dissolve, the feeling of helplessness that some of them get, the struggles they have with their identity. These are all things that I experienced when I was growing up. So I think as long as the emotional core of your book is true, it doesn't matter whether it's based on actual real life events, right? You know what it's like to feel pain. You know what it's like to feel lonely. You know what it's like to feel accepted and loved and appreciated, I hope. And so you just harness those emotions that you've experienced in your own life, and then you filter them through your characters and the conflicts that they're going through. Eternity also asks, how long did it take you to write Posted? Well, the book Posted took about 6 weeks to write, but then it took about 8 months to revise, and it was the longest and probably most difficult revision process that I've been through with any of my novels. And part of that has to do with the fact that I killed somebody. In the first draft, one of the main characters gets fed up with everything that's going on in his life, borrows his brother's moped, wipes out on the street, and dies from a brain aneurysm. And so the other characters go to his funeral. And my editor asked me, he said, why is it that we always wait for the absolute worst thing to happen before we decide to enact change, right? Why wait for the environment to go to pot before we decide we're going to try and save the world, right? And we went back and looked at what happened to that character, decided that it didn't have to go that far, right? So I had to go back and rewrite the last third of the novel in order to bring this character back to life. But that's okay, right? Because it's my book. I'm God. I can do whatever I want. Eternity also asks, what was your favorite part of the book? And actually I have a lot of parts of Posted that strike home with me. I like the gauntlet scene because it's the sort of action-packed climax. The whole reason I wrote that was because I like James Bond movies, and the best part of any James Bond movie or Jason Bourne movie is the car chase. And I thought, well, this book, which is mostly about talking and conversation, it needs some action. So I needed a car chase, but these characters are too young to drive. So I thought, well, what's the equivalent, the sort of young teen equivalent of a car chase? It's a bike race down a deadly hill. But that's not my favorite scene. My favorite scene, it actually takes place in Wolf's house during the Dungeons & Dragons game, where Rose shows up and completely disrupts the system. And she changes all the rules. And she decides she's going to be a ninja warrior princess, and it freaks Dee Dee out. But eventually they come to accept her, and they all end up sitting on a couch watching TV together. And I think I like this scene because it's one more example of Rose being the hero, stepping in to show the other characters that they can just be themselves, right? That they don't have to be hemmed in by other people's rules and definitions of who they should be. Rose can be anybody she chooses to be because she has that kind of self-confidence. And that's what's sort of cool about Dungeons & Dragons, too, if you think about it, is this notion that we can take on other identities, right? We can give ourselves powers and attributes and characteristics that allow us to overcome the evils and the obstacles that we're facing in real life. The key, of course, is being able to translate that to real life and finding ways to empower yourself and have agency so that you can act some kind of positive change in the world around you. Finally, Angie asks, what are you writing next? I have a book that just came out called One Last Shot. It looks a little bit like this. Whoa. It is a sports novel. A lot of times when I set out to write a book, I try to experiment with new genres, new approaches, and I've never written a sports novel before. But I'm terrible at every sport, except for miniature golf. Well, I think it's important to always be doing something that engages your imagination. Otherwise, it's going to atrophy, right? It's like any other muscle. If you don't use it, it just freezes up and withers up and dies. So take this time now, right? We're all sort of stuck inside anyways. To be creative, to find a way to express yourself, to find a way to tell a story about the experiences that are happening to you, that are happening to all of us. And to find a way to use those stories to connect with other people. But since this is the book that just came out, One Last Shot, I thought I would tell you guys a little bit about it and then just read a little passage. And then maybe it'll pique your interest. So the book is about a character named Malcolm who has a voice of doubt inside of his head, and he always feels like he's not good enough. And he gets a lot of pressure from his dad to be better, and his parents are sort of going through a rocky spot in their marriage, and he feels like his responsibility to hold the family together. And he's struggling to do so. And he really just wants to find like the one thing that he can be good at, right? And somehow that will be the glue that bonds the three of them. So this passage comes from pretty early on. Malcolm has sort of been forced into playing Little League by his father. And this is his take on how sports generally go. There's that moment in sports movies when the hero has his back to the wall, and he's got a broken leg and a black eye and 2 teeth knocked out, and his team is down by just enough to lose, and the crowd is speechless, holding its breath. And the music is building to a big finale, and you get the close-up of the hero's face, and you can see the determination in his eyes. And he looks to his coach or his fiancée or his former nemesis, who recently became his best friend, and he gets the nod. And then the hero does that move, the one that shouldn't work because it's never been done before. And in that moment, the music stops as you watch the move in slow motion, and you hold your breath too, even though you know exactly what's going to happen. The crowd explodes, the music swells, and the hero hoists the trophy as he's surrounded by his cheering teammates. Believe it or not, that kind of stuff does happen. It just doesn't happen to me. So that's pretty much it from me. Thanks for watching. Thanks for reading my books. I hope that everybody is doing well, staying safe, finding ways to connect with each other, finding ways to be kind to each other, and finding ways to tell your own personal story. Take care. Keep reading.
Hey, Algonquin Algonquin, Mrs. Ekstrom here. I wanted to help celebrate Richtall's Read All Day by reading a little bit from J.K. Rowling's new manuscript, The Ichabod. Don't forget, there's a special contest. She's looking for illustrations from kids all over the world. And remember, she'll be releasing a few chapters every weekday from this manuscript. After it's published, some proceeds will go to victims of COVID-19. And now, the Ichabod. Chapter 1 is called King Fred the Fearless. Once upon a time, there was a tiny country called Cornucopia, which had been ruled for centuries by a long line of fair-haired kings. The king at the time of which I write was called King Fred the Fearless. He'd announced the fearless bit himself on the morning of his coronation, partly because it sounded nice with Fred, but also because he'd once managed to catch and kill a wasp all by himself, if you didn't count 5 footmen and the boot boy. King Fred the Fearless came to the throne on a huge wave of popularity. He had lovely yellow curls, a fine, sweeping mustache, and looked magnificent in the tight breeches, velvet doublets, and ruffled shirts that rich men wore at the time. Fred was said to be generous, smiled and waved when anyone caught sight of him, and looked awfully handsome in the portraits that were distributed throughout the kingdom, to be hung in town halls. The people of Cornucopia were most happy with their new king, and many thought he'd end up being even better at the job than his father, Richard the Righteous, whose teeth, though nobody had liked to mention it at the time, were rather crooked. King Fred was secretly relieved to find out how easy it was to rule Cornucopia. In fact, the country seemed to run itself. Nearly everybody had lots of food, the merchants made pots of gold, and Fred's advisors took care of any little problem that arose. All that was left for Fred to do was beam at his subjects whenever he went out in his carriage and go hunting 5 times a week with his 2 best friends, Lord Spittleworth and Lord Flapoon. Spittleworth and Flapoon had large estates of their own in the country, but they found it much cheaper and more amusing to live at the palace with the king, eating his food, hunting his stags, and making sure that the king didn't get too fond of any of the beautiful ladies at court. They had no wish to see Fred married, because a queen might spoil all their fun. For a time, Fred had seemed to rather like Lady Eslanda, who was as dark and beautiful as Fred was fair and handsome. But Spittleworth had persuaded Fred that she was far too serious and bookish for the country to love her as a queen. Fred didn't know that Lord Spittleworth had a grudge against Lady Eslanda. He'd once asked her to marry him, but she'd turned him down. Lord Spittleworth was very thin, cunning, and clever. His friend Flapoon was ruddy-faced and so enormous that it required 6 men to heave him onto his massive chestnut horse. Though not as clever as Spittleworth, Flapoon was still far sharper than the king. Both lords were expert at flattery and pretending to be astonished by how good Fred was at everything from riding to tiddlywinks. If Spittleworth had a particular talent, it was persuading the king to do things that suited Spittleworth, and if Flapoon had a gift, it was for convincing the king that nobody on earth was as loyal to the king as his 2 best friends. Fred thought Spittleworth and Flapoon were jolly good chaps. They urged him to hold fancy parties, elaborate picnics, and sumptuous banquets, because Cornucopia was famous far beyond its borders for its food. Each of its cities was known for a different kind, and each was the very best in the world. The capital of Cornucopia, Chouville, lay in the south of the country and was surrounded by acres of orchards, fields of shimmering golden wheat, and emerald green grass on which pure white dairy cows grazed. The cream, the flour, and the fruit produced by the farmers here was then given to the exceptional bakers of Chouville, who made pastries. Think, if you please, of the most delicious cake or cookie you have ever tasted. Well, let me tell you, They'd have been downright ashamed to serve that in Chewville. Unless a grown man's eyes filled with tears of pleasure as he bit into a Chewville pastry, it was deemed a failure and never made again. The bakery windows of Chewville were piled high with delicacies such as maiden's dreams, fairies' cradles, and the most famous of all, hopes of heaven, which were so exquisitely, painfully delicious that they were saved for special occasions, and everybody cried for joy as they ate them. King Porfirio of neighboring Puritania had already sent King Fred a letter offering him the choice of any of his daughter's hands in marriage in exchange for a lifetime supply of hopes of heaven. But Spittleworth had advised Fred to laugh in the Puritanian ambassador's face. "His daughters are nowhere near pretty enough to exchange for hopes of heaven, sire," said Spittleworth. To the north of Chewville lay more green fields and clear, sparkling rivers, where jet-black cows and happy pink pigs were raised. These in turn served the twin cities of Curdsburg and Barronstown, which were separated from each other by an arching stone bridge over the main river of Cornucopia, the Fluma, where brightly colored barges bore goods from one end of the kingdom to another. Cudsburg was famous for its cheeses, huge white wheels, dense orange cannonballs, big crumbly blue-veined barrels, and little baby cream cheeses smoother than velvet. Barronstown was celebrated for its smoky and honey-roasted hams, its sides of bacon, its spicy sausages, its melting beefsteaks, and its venison pies. The savory fumes rising from the chimneys of the red brick Barronstown stoves mingled with the odorous tang wafting from the doorways of the Curdsburg cheesemongers, and for 40 miles all around it, it was impossible not to salivate, breathing in the delicious air. A few hours north of Curdsburg and Barronstown, you came across acres of vineyards bearing grapes as large as eggs, each of them ripe and sweet and juicy. Journey onward for the rest of the day, and you reach the granite city of Jeroboam, famous for its wines. They said of the Jeroboam air that you could get tipsy simply walking its streets. The best vintages changed hands for thousands upon thousands of gold coins, and the Jeroboam wine merchants were some of the richest men in the kingdom. But a little north of Jeroboam, a strange thing happened. It was as though the magically rich land of Cornucopia had exhausted itself by producing the best grass, the best fruit, and the best wheat in the world. Right at the northern tip came the place known as the marshlands, and the only thing that grew there were some tasteless, rubbery mushrooms and thin, dry grass, only good enough to feed a few mangy sheep. The marshlanders who tended the sheep didn't have the sleek, well-rounded, well-dressed appearance of the citizens of Jeroboam, Barronstown, Curdsburg, or Chewville. They were gaunt and ragged. Their poorly nourished sheep never fetched very good prices, either in Cornucopia or abroad, so very few marshlanders ever got to taste the delights of the cornucopian wine, cheese, beef, or pastries. The most common dish in the marshlands was a greasy mutton broth made of those sheep who were too old to sell. The rest of Cornucopia found the marshlanders an odd bunch, surly, dirty, and ill-tempered. They had rough voices, which the other cornucopians imitated, making them sound like hoarse old sheep. Jokes were made about their manners and their simplicity. As far as the rest of Cornucopia was concerned, the only memorable thing that had ever come out of the marshlands was the legend of the Ichabod. And that is the end of this chapter, but you can continue reading. If you Google the Ichabod, you will get to a website just for the Ichabod, and you can read a few chapters that will be released every day. Thanks for listening. Don't forget about the special contest.
And that concludes our morning announcements. Remember, from start to finish, every day, we embody the warrior way.